evening, everyone. I'm Deandra Rose, and I'm a professor here at the Duke University School of the Sanford School of Public Policy here at Duke, and I serve as the Director of Research for Polis, the Center for Politics. I am delighted to welcome you to tonight's event. Polis, the Center for Politics, works to increase our understanding of politics by promoting cutting-edge research, by fostering rich political discussions, and by helping a new generation of leaders find on-ramps to public service. This evening, we are honored to have Professor Lesley Babinski and Mr. Everton Blair with us for a conversation about COVID-19 and K-12 education. This event is part of the Polis Innovation Accelerator, which works to help students produce bold solutions for our most pressing political problems. So I'm going to turn it over to Morena Martinez, our Polis PhD fellow, to say a few quick words about the Innovation Accelerator. And then I will turn it over to an introduction for I guess I'll introduce our guests tonight and we'll get started with the conversation. So Morena, over to you.
Thanks so much, Professor Rose. Good evening, and thank you everyone for joining us. Each year, the Innovation Accelerator will offer speaker events and workshops centered around a particular theme. This year's theme is Justice and Citizenship in a Time of COVID. The goal is to encourage people in our community to think up bold policy solutions to today's biggest political problems. All year, we've hosted illuminating conversations with experts on topics like structural inequality, mail-in voting, the future of the U.S. healthcare system, and education during a pandemic. We're also very excited to host our very first policy solutions competition this semester, which will give undergraduate and graduate students an opportunity to compete for prizes by crafting innovative policy proposals to address challenges related to racial justice, the COVID-19 pandemic, science and technology, and voter participation. Proposals for that competition are due this Thursday, March 4th at 5 p.m. For more information on the policy pitch competition, upcoming events, and videos of our previous events, please visit our website at polis.duke.edu. For tonight's event, we hope that you'll be thinking of questions you'd like to ask our panelists and enter them into the chat box and send them to one of our wonderful Director's Fellows, Max Wilkie. Thank you so much, and I'll turn it over to Professor Rose.
Thank you so much, Morena. Well, without further ado, I'm excited to introduce our very special guest for this evening. So first we have Professor Lesley Babinski, who is an associate research professor here at the Sanford School of Public Policy, and she serves as the director of the Center for Child and Family Policy. She's an educational psychologist and studies school-based interventions to support student success. Professor Babinski is currently studying the impact of a teacher professional development program for kindergarten, first grade, and English as a second language teachers to support English learners' language and literacy development. So Professor Babinski, thank you so much for being with us tonight. Thank you so much, Professor Babinski. We're also delighted to have with us Mr. Everton Blair, who is the first person of color, the youngest ever, and the first openly gay member of the Gwinnett County Board of Education, serving 180,000 students and 1 million constituents in the largest and most diverse school system in the state of Georgia. He's the son of Jamaican immigrants and a 2009 graduate of Gwinnett County Schools. In his current full-time role as National Governance Director at New American Leaders, Mr. Blair supports first and second generation Americans in state and local elected office. So welcome, Mr. Blair. We're so excited to have you here with us tonight.
Thanks for having me, Dr. Rose. It's a pleasure to be in the midst of another Gwinnett County alum.
That I am a very proud alum. Well, to start us off, I'm going to stick with Gwinnett County for a minute. Mr. Blair, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about Gwinnett County. It's a really unique space for a number of the reasons I mentioned in your bio. Can you tell us a little bit about Gwinnett County and a little bit about your background and how you came to serve on the school board?
Yeah, and feel free to chime in since you have personal lived experience too. We are a big and diverse, sprawling suburb northeast of Atlanta, Georgia, and underwent a huge demographic transition, mostly after the '96 Olympics and then over the next 2 decades after that. where we just saw an incredible increase in people of color. Our school district and school system diversified quite rapidly. And by 2010, we were a majority minority school district. Like most things, when the community diversifies, the leadership level diversifies the slowest. And so we saw a huge increase in teachers of color and even principals of color, but had not yet seen that change to our school board. And in 2018, when I chose to run, a part of my campaign was around the representation aspect of our school system serving 76% students of color and having no people of color on our board. But it was also a chance, I think, to center some of the education issues that we've been talking about and that I had been studying, where we really wanted to meet this moment where our community had so deeply expanded. We had doubled in 2 decades, just the number of students that we were serving. And so I think we needed to get really clear on how we were meeting those needs and have a current educator who was talking about that stuff. And so one of the many things that I think Gwinnett experienced 2 years ago was that leadership transition. And we're still a very diverse and thriving in many ways community. And so now it's just, how do we meet that moment with the leaders that we are now seeing that we put forth?
So Professor Babinski, you're a researcher who examines school-based interventions for children and adolescents, as well as teachers' professional development. So, hearing Mr. Blair describe Gwinnett County, I'm wondering, are you hearing anything that resonates with your experience in schools and some of the observations that you've made in your research?
Yes, thank you, Deandra, and thank you so much for including me in this conversation. We're in such an extraordinary time in education, an extraordinary time overall, but education has just gone through a transformation like we've never seen before, and the impacts are going to be seen for quite a while. So I'm really happy to be sharing the discussion tonight with Mr. Blair, and I appreciate his emphasis on the change in diversity in Gwinnett County. My own research is with, as you mentioned, kindergarten and first grade teachers, ESL or English as a second language teachers, to help support literacy and language development for their English learners. And so I've been particularly focused on the Latino community in North Carolina and what has been happening with them during the pandemic. Last school year, I was in the middle of a study looking at the impact of our professional development program on English learners when teachers switched to remote or emergency instruction really in the spring. And a lot of what I've been learning about what's happening in education has been through the eyes of those teachers and their students as they've tried to navigate this really extraordinary time. So thank you for inviting me to this conversation.
Well, thank you so much, both of you, for being with us tonight. So Lesley, you mentioned just how extraordinary these times are and some of the pressures that our different communities are facing. So I'm excited to dig into those topics in the course of this discussion. But maybe to start off, I'd love to talk to you both about school reopening, which I feel like was a really sort of central topic, a topic of much contention over the last, few months, set of months. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about some of the conversations that you've heard about K-12 schools reopening. And maybe I'll start with you, Professor Babinski. What does reopening schools mean for students when it comes to both academics and safety?
Yeah, actually, this is a really timely discussion. It's forefront in the news even today in North Carolina. North Carolina just released the results of end of course testing for the first semester and early grade fall testing. And we learned that not surprisingly, many students are falling behind. More students than the previous fall failed math end of course tests. So students are struggling, I guess I'll just say. And also in the news today, and if anyone sees this during the session, if you could just let me know, the state is voting on making reopening schools mandatory. As many of you know, the governor last week vetoed the bill that would make reopening schools mandatory for all students in North Carolina. And we're waiting to see if that gets overridden in a vote tonight while we're having this session. So just a little bit about what's happening in North Carolina with the reopening. So back in October, elementary schools were permitted to be reopened under Plan A, which meant in-person learning, while middle and high schools remained in hybrid. After the holidays, along with many places in the country, we saw a spike in COVID cases. And so many school districts opted to go fully remote at that time. And so there's been a lot of back and forth and hybrid between in-person and remote instruction in North Carolina schools. Just recently, many school districts have laid out their plans for reopening, especially for the middle and high schoolers who've now been out of their school buildings for close to a year. And every district is a little bit different. And we could talk about that in a minute if we want to go in that direction. But I think one of the things that the opening and reopening and back to remote and reopening is really highlighting for those of us who work in education are the compounding inequities and how many of the equity issues that we had in education are just being heightened and highlighted by the impact of the pandemic. And I think it's a really important moment in time when everyone recognizes the essential nature of schools in the functioning of our communities and our families and our students. And so now's the time to pay attention to addressing those inequities, certainly for the crisis we're in, but also for the long term. So looking forward to talking with you more about that.
Thank you so much. Mr. Blair, I wonder if you could speak to what the reopening conversation has looked like in Gwinnett County.
Yeah, it has by far been the least favorite debate of my time as a board member, mostly because the context that we're facing is so non-ideal. And also because I think that the term is a misnomer at its core. When we say reopening, we're really not, schools were open, they were virtual. And so even now that they, in many cases, and in Gwinnett County's case, we're offering the choice to families to send their kids face-to-face or virtually, they're still not fully all in person. And so there's this kind of contention around the safety precaution that we were affording teachers that led us to begin an all virtual instruction. And then in last spring, like many school districts, we were virtual for the majority of for the remainder of the school year. Now we've offered the hybrid option for essentially all of our families who choose it. And then teachers are concurrently doing face-to-face and in-person instruction. It is incredibly stressful, it is not ideal. Our staff is burnt out. And even in the most ideal situation, we're not meeting everyone's needs. But I think to piggyback on Professor Babinski's point, my hope, my silver lining is that maybe we'll begin to see schools as the social service hub that they've always been, and put the resources, put our money where our mouth is finally, and recognizing just the incredible and integral service that schools provide community. And now seeing some of the exacerbated effects of, not having those counselors who are recognizing the social and emotional and mental health needs of our students, not having the guarantee of safe transportation and food security for many of our students, and not having the touch point that assures that we are attending to the needs of minors in our society. Those things are so critical that we should make sure we put the budget resources there, even post-pandemic. And, fortunately, I'm seeing a lot of interest in stressing that for the purpose of reopening schools, but I'm not seeing enough interest in stressing that for the purpose of funding it adequately so that we meet the need.
So can I stay on this idea of what the sort of day-to-day operation of schools looks like in the midst of this pandemic? And so Everton, as you said a moment ago, we're talking about reopening schools, but a lot of this conversation elides over the fact that the schools are indeed opening, they're still operating, it just looks different right now. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, a little more about some of the what does it take to make this work? And I should say I have a nephew who's in Gwinnett County schools. And I remember early on in the pandemic, there was discussion of technology that would be provided to different families. And I'm really, when I heard it, I was like, ooh, that's really ambitious. So I'd love to hear just about, the sort of logistics of making this work.
Yeah, we were not a district that was one-to-one initially. There were many urban districts that were. I think a part of this is also a bigger conversation about suburban sprawl, and how when previously you didn't conceive of the school district as needing to make all of the above and beyond efforts to make sure that your kids had everything that you need, and then you have more kids, it kind of compounds the tall order that you probably weren't meeting even beforehand. And so the reality is there were school districts, our neighbors closer to the urban core, that were moving toward one-to-one. And so then it became incumbent upon us to get really close to that. And so we met the demonstrated need. And what that literally meant was buying a whole bunch of Chromebooks and sending out social workers and surveys, and literally using our transportation staff to be technological delivery men and women, and making sure that our students had the devices, and even in many cases, the hotspots to connect to the internet, because the Chromebook became your textbook. And we were able to successfully broach that conversation, and many school districts were doing that work. The problem is we got a lot of dead zones in the county. And so if you're only offering T-Mobile as the service provider for your hotspots, then you still have some access issues in particular communities. And we met the demonstrated need, but the demonstrated need might not have been the actual need, because we also recognize that we lost critical contact with many of our communities, about 10% of which we have not sufficiently regained. And so the question is, like, where are some of our students, and what are we doing to make sure that when we come back from this, like, making a deeper investment in the equitable needs of those kids first. And yes, the devices are great. I'm glad that we raised that as a need, and we'll continue to move to one-to-one. But my focus is almost like, of course we needed to do that, but now there's so many other things that we now have to focus on, and the devices are not going to solve that. And if we continue to think that, like, putting our money in something material is going to be the work that we need to do, we're going to miss a really important moment going forward, and like the service and capacity building work and staff members that we're going to need to really tend to these issues that we're going to see show up in our buildings soon.
Mm-hmm. Lesley, I wonder what you're seeing in terms of the logistics and whether the needs of students are being met on a daily basis, but also teachers, wondering about what are our teachers getting in terms of support, and how are they doing their jobs?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for asking about teachers. And just back to Mr. Blair's point about the one-to-one computing access, it was a similar effort in North Carolina in distributing Chromebooks and hotspots to students. But I agree with your point that that is such a baseline and doesn't get us anywhere near equitable access. In my own study with English learners, we heard from teachers that about half of our students required a device from the school to be able to access learning in the spring, and about a quarter needed a hotspot. But imagine dropping off a Chromebook and a hotspot to a family that has not had Wi-Fi in their home. And the students we were working with were kindergarten and first grade, so there was no expectation that they knew how to log on to the learning platforms at school by themselves. The students I was working with had families that spoke Spanish in their home primarily. And so we also had the language issues in accessing the technology. So it's been a really chaotic time in terms of the very basics of giving equitable access to all of our students. And so that's definitely a huge issue. But from the point of view of teachers, they've been doing an extraordinary job, the ones I've been working with in North Carolina schools, in trying to meet all their students' needs. We heard in the spring of teachers going door to door to deliver the Chromebooks and the hotspots, delivering school materials to students. All of this, of course, off the record, they weren't being asked in many cases to do this, but they were so dedicated to being sure that their students were being cared for, and that they were safe, and that they were connected to them. And so teachers have been going through quite a lot. In North Carolina, there are many different models currently in play, and good point about schools not closing or reopening. They are open. It's just whether or not they're providing in-person instruction, hybrid, or entirely remote instruction. Some teachers are focusing on one mode of instruction, while others are simultaneously teaching both their in-person students and their online students. And those of us involved in higher ed know how challenging that could be to try to manage not only the content, but the technology behind that and student engagement. And we're also talking about students at all levels now, right? So we're talking about the youngest students, kindergartners and first graders, who really should not be in front of screens for that much time, whose attention spans really are not well matched for online learning, who need an adult. That's another thing we found in our study, that the students in the spring who were the most successful in online learning had an adult or a sibling in the home who could sit with the young child during online instruction. So now we're asking parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles, and in some cases, older siblings. We had some examples of second grade students supporting their kindergarten sisters' access to online learning. Really heartwarming stories from teachers, kindergarten, first grade teachers who talk about former students of theirs who, now gone on to second and third grade who are helping their younger siblings. So it's really been quite an effort to help students benefit from education during this time.
So I'm really fascinated by this discussion of various online or various learning formats. So thinking about the option of online versus in person or some sort of hybrid. I'd love to hear a little bit, if you could talk about the decisions that have shaped which approaches we're embracing or we're seeing embraced in different contexts. Maybe Everton, if I can start with you. Do you have a sense of sort of whose preferred learning options are getting the most emphasis? Like, what's shaping that?
So I think the unfortunate tendency is for us to, even when we offer two things, to try to do, like, instead of a one size fits all, a two size fits all. And so the reality of the circumstances that I'm seeing are that teachers' classrooms are much more full in the lower grades and much more remote in the upper grades, which makes sense for the reasons that Dr. Babinski shared, for the realizing that for many of the younger students, you need an adult there, and then that being encumbering for many of our families, they're choosing. And also, I think, is a major contributory factor that the virus has a lesser impact on younger kids. Many more families are choosing to continue to send their kids in person. And what that means is, in my view, where I have seen a great need is for the early grades, the early teachers, to be able to really serve their remote students requires incredible skill, because in many cases they have slightly more than a majority of their students in person who have pressing, ordinary, that's what they anticipated when they went to teacher college, is having students in front of them. And then they've got probably 15 to 40% of their roster remote. And the acute attention to detail that requires, and the real difficulty in understanding what your students can see and are doing remote, while concurrently dealing with more students than that number, is, I think, especially critical for early grades, because even just so much of the access and awareness of how to use the technology is a challenge. And then when we add in many of our special education services and supports for English learners, it is very difficult. And I think we just name it. We do a better job when we get back in person, and we prioritize those students for early interventions in summer school and after school, and all of the things that we will need to resource in order to make things better. For upper grades, I'm a little bit less concerned, because many more of those students have shown success at being able to do the remote learning. But it's still a challenge there, because many of the families who were already the most behind, or for whom the kids were experiencing educational difficulties, were the ones that, for reasons of kind of health risk, needed to stay at home. And we saw that in the disproportionate impact that COVID has had on our society, where particularly Black and Brown families were making the remote choice. And we've got to make sure that we're naming that transparently and clearly, so that we can serve those students when we go back as well.
So I'm hearing so much about equity in your response, Everton. And Lesley, I'd love to hear, what's on your mind when it comes to the pandemic and K-12 education, when it comes to sort of contributing to or exacerbating issues related to equity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the equity issues are really front and center, I think, in what's happening now with the response to COVID. We know that our communities of color are harder hit, as Red said, in terms of the transmission of COVID, the risk of severe impacts, even higher death rates. They're more likely to be food and housing insecure. We know that the families that I'm working with are more likely to be essential workers, more likely to need to work outside the home, be at higher risk in their jobs because of their exposure to COVID. So we have all these inequities and disparities that are compounding to make these students and families even more vulnerable that really needs to be addressed at this time. There was a recent Pew Center study of adults about their feelings about returning to in-person schooling. And I'm interested in what Mr. Blair just said about some of the communities of color electing to be remote. The Pew Center study, it was of parents, it was a national study, and they asked about, would you feel comfortable sending your children back to school before all the teachers were vaccinated, or would you prefer to wait until all the teachers who wanted to be vaccinated received one? And the racial breakdown is striking. 80% of Black parents said that schools should remain remote until all teachers who want the vaccine get one, and that's compared to 51% of white students. There's a similar breakdown for socioeconomic status as well. And I've heard education researchers talking about these disparities and why that may be. And communities of color certainly have seen a disinvestment in their school buildings and the quality of the actual infrastructure available to their students. There's a mistrust about schools being able to keep students safe in this environment. And so I've heard the term now school hesitancy, where certain communities are feeling uncomfortable sending their students to in-person school. So those are some of the things that I'm seeing, and additional barriers to helping students be successful, and needing really multidisciplinary approach to addressing the inequities and the educational impacts of the pandemic.
And Dr. Rose, I'd just add, like, if you think about the converse and the positive framing of that, it's that the equitable thing to do would be to make sure that your staff is vaccinated before compromising their safety. And communities of color are disproportionately choosing equity in making that calculation. And so in order to do right by them, we should be doing that very same thing and choosing their needs of their students first. I've been really transparent, and like, I don't care how far you want to go. If it's good for kids and if it's equitable and if you want to reprioritize the budget to do it, I can defend it, right? If you want to have, summer school just for this group of kids who chose digital the entire year and were falling behind, let's just do it for, like, whatever it is, come up with the resources, y'all do the budget, I'm going to support that thing. But we just need leaders who are actually giving voice to that as an urgent and primary concern, because in the absence of that, I think we're going to do more of kind of the status quo conventional stuff, which is people who opt in or people who are the most well aware of what the resources in community are going to take the most advantage of them. And that's not their fault either, but we've got to do the extra effort to make sure that for all of those folks who were underserved during the pandemic and probably before, we're prioritizing them first and giving them the spot and giving them the support and the investment that they need and deserve.
Mm-hmm. So I want to turn to this topic of what's next and what can leaders do. But before that, I would love to, I guess, tag on to Leslie's question and pose it to you, Everton. Are you seeing similar racial breakdowns in terms of an inclination to, engage in in-person classroom, experiences versus remote experiences in your county, or any other interesting breakdowns that you're seeing?
Yes, I don't have the hard data, but without a doubt, absolutely. And I grew up and attended schools in our predominantly Black community in the district, and it's a much less populated building than even the other schools in the district and in my district that I serve. And so, it is the case that more of our teachers teaching large proportions of students of color have more of their rosters remote, even still. And that itself is going to have a need for us to look at, like, what the result of that is. But I don't have any of that hard data yet. It's just been observational for me and what I've been able to see in walking schools and meeting with leaders. To that point, though, I think that when we do some of this academic summative review, we'll be able to see where the needs are next year. And we're in this space where I think y'all were talking about where you'll land with the summative assessment requirements in the state. We're doing the same kind of back and forth where it looks like we're still going to give the assessment, but it's going to be worth like 0.01% or something, which probably is the right thing to do. But at the end of the day, I would be more concerned about formatively what we're doing about it next year. And so a lot of my shift has just been around like putting enough of the board leadership's energy in proactive resource allocation, because so much of the last year has been responding to fires and, you know, meeting needs emergently, that we were kind of in that mode of operation, where I think now we have to build some space for us to just think forward and recognize that like we're gonna have incredibly severe needs that we have to address, and somebody's got to do that work right now while we continue to react to the needs that we've been experiencing.
So
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that.
So I guess curious about what comes next and what we do now. And Everton, you've spoken about this a little bit in your most recent answer, but one of the things that we're trying to do here with the Polis Innovation Accelerator is to think really carefully about the problems, but to focus really intently on the solutions and how we get there. So if you could prioritize, or you could, you know, advocate to our leaders in terms of what their priorities should be or ought to be to get us through this academic year and then in the coming years, what would you recommend?
Like you're talking magic wand, magic budget?
Magic wand, magic budget. And then maybe, you know, the actual wand and your current budget.
Yeah, I mean, if there were infinite resources, I think we could meet the need. If we're in a position where we're having to look at this fixed sum of money and choose where we do what and for whom, then I think that the equity conversation commands us to focus on the students that we left behind. I think we've named most of those populations on this call. It is students receiving special education services, it's students in early grades, it's a focus on literacy and our English learners, and it's the focus on students who were chronically behind before the pandemic. And if we can prioritize the staffing allocation so that those students are getting the most intensive small group instruction possible over courses of periods of summer plus after school plus, you know, kind of going forward next year, then I think that we'll do really the best job that we've ever done in meeting their needs. I think that another interesting way to take that question is with the heightened focus, righteously so, around mental health and social and emotional learning. What does that look like in operation for us? Because so much of how we have conceived of this has been through the counseling department, and it has been very ad hoc, that I'm wondering what that means for our teachers of the ordinary academic canon and how we build in the capacity for them to increase their pedagogy around social and emotional instruction and trauma-informed instruction, because we know that we're going to see more of that next year. And we do that in a way that's actually empowering to teachers and doesn't just feel like another thing that they're going to make me do with no support. And so, you know, those are the everyday real talk conversations I'm having with staff members where everybody wants to do the right thing, but we have to both find the money for it. We have to do it in a way that is doing no harm and a lot of good, and then kind of create the capacity for teachers who are already going to come back and have crazy days and long hours and now more students with more needs to actually be able to feel good about the work that they're setting forth to do. And that's going to take a lot of time. But I think, you know, the magic wand stuff would be create schedules that actually give them the space to prepare for their jobs and do it well. And if we are going to bring them back into burnt out factories where they're still doing the same number of preps and the same number of stuff and they have no time to learn, prepare, grow, develop, like we're not going to do right by them. And that's not going to be a job that they can, successfully do. And we should be trying to prioritize that in a way that's manageable and encouraging.
Lesley, can I pose the same question to you? What would you recommend that leaders focus on to get us through this year and beyond?
Yeah, well, I agree with everything that Everton said, especially about focusing on the populations that we know are struggling during the pandemic and supporting their learning. And I would say more through accelerated learning rather than remediation. So compacting the curriculum where we need to help students have exposure to grade level content, but really ramp up the academic skills. So that's going to be super important. So many things really. You mentioned social emotional needs of students. Our teachers have always attended to the social and emotional needs of their students. It's a thing that doesn't get measured, so it doesn't get reported, isn't really, a part of our conversation that much, but really teachers have always done this. And I think it really became highlighted when we all moved to online instruction, and that was a lot harder to do. Students are isolated. They're losing that connection with the adults in their lives. They're missing their peers. So there are a lot more mental health challenges. So I appreciate your comment about trauma-informed approaches for reconnecting with students. And I feel like it's time we give teachers credit for that amount of work they do in supporting our children in their social and emotional development. It's crucial. I think having a school-wide approach where every adult in the building understands how to connect with students, how to recognize when their behavior, whether it's acting out or withdrawn or some combination of conflict and withdrawn, is probably coming from a place of need rather than a place of defiance or opposition, and that we all have to be able to respond in a compassionate and caring way in a school building. That's going to take training. It's going to take a positive work environment for the teachers. It can't be just psychologists and counselors at this point. Every student is going to need support. And then I also want to mention that the adults also need support. So every teacher has been through this trauma as well. Some more than others, of course, some who've personally experienced illness or the loss of someone in their family. So we have to recognize that both the children and the adults are coming back into in-person schooling in a different way than they left, and that the school community is the place where we can support social and emotional learning. But back to the magic wand and what would you do? So definitely, like in terms of the short-term crisis, I would say funding for summer learning programs in North Carolina is moving in that direction to make summer learning opportunities available for students. Improved school infrastructure. I would love for finally all of us to pay attention to the quality of our school buildings and put the funding behind making sure that we've got hot and cold running water, that we have soap, and that we have good ventilation, and we have outdoor spaces for students to gather. So all of the things that really should have been givens and basics before the pandemic, now it's really, really clear that we can't overlook that our students deserve that, and we need to provide it. So we mentioned the mental health services, we mentioned acceleration. I've heard people talking about looping. You might remember this from like a decade ago when it was popular, and that is a teacher staying with their students for more than 1 year of instruction, particularly in the elementary grades. This idea that there's going to be accelerated learning, and it's good for a teacher to get to know students over the course of a year or two. I think increased collaboration and co-teaching and teacher professional development. We can't expect teachers to do all of this extra work without additional support. I think more time for planning, more time for talking about their students and the impact of the instruction on their students. All of it costs money and is going to take an awful lot of effort. But I think Mr. Blair is exactly right that while we're living through the crisis and the return to in-person schooling right now, we've got to be planning for the future, both the short-term goals as well as our long-term goals in education.
I want to double down on something else that Professor Babinski just mentioned, which was this talk about acceleration instead of remediation. I think that's going to be really, really important and probably a little bit of a paradigm shift, because I think even pre-pandemic, we weren't really doing the best job at maintaining access to grade level instruction for students who find themselves in the next grade, but are, proficiently somewhere grades 2 or 3 years before. And I think that the access point and the pedagogy around how you kind of strategically loop in prerequisite scaffolds while keeping the kind of nature of the instruction that is before the students front and center. To be very transparent, I never learned how to do very well as a teacher and still struggle with. And I think conceptually is a huge learning curve for us, and probably will take the majority of our PD time in the next, well, forever.
Thank you so much. And Everton, I guess, if I may, Lesley pointed to, I think, a really critical issue of funding. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit from your perspective as a school board member, why is it so hard for us to plan ahead for things like this? I feel like in political science, we talk a lot about sort of fire alarm governance versus patrol style governance, where typically we're more likely to respond to crises than to act proactively. So can you tell us a little bit about your perspective on that, especially when it comes to the budget and what we will allocate our resources toward?
This is a big one. My actual answer is that there's not as much fear involved with public education. And we do proactively fund things when we're operating out of a space of fear. And like danger, violence, like things of that sort. Like we'll fund a police budget. We'll fund a military budget. But public education as a social safety net gets cut because we think about it as this fixed resource. And in doing so, we then end up only increasing that funding when we're responding to crisis. And even, in many cases, not even increasing it, just reallocating it and taking away from the already essential things that we were supposed to be funding. What do we need to do to change that? I think is at a minimum, just like elect people who believe the opposite and will put the needs of the social kind of services of the community first, because that will attenuate and kind of solve for the needs for fear, danger, responding to crisis, all of those other pieces later down the line. But it takes a big picture person. It takes folks seeing the forest. It takes just a willingness to put resources forth. And then there's also kind of the personal responsibility dynamic that I think we're all noticing pop back up, where it's like people don't feel like it should be their job to do something for other people's kids. But if we noticed anything in this year, it is that schools were important and essential to every person, every student, from every socioeconomic status, from every racial group. They served a critical function. And so if we believe that, which so many of us did, then again, we should adhere to that going forward. And that means you need schools, everyone needs schools, we must fund schools, and this is what they should look like. And this is what it's going to cost. And we will be able to make that work in the society that we live, just like we prioritize all these other things that we may or may not need as vitally.
So we're getting some fantastic questions from the audience. And so I will turn to those right now. And Professor Babinski, I'll start with you, if I may. So with respect to technological awareness, what recommendations do you have for increasing this awareness in parents? Should schools invest in training parents, especially considering the returns to in-person schooling?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, we did a parent survey over the summer of the parents of the English learners in our study, and they recommended just that. They said we should have trainings for the parents, show us how to get onto Google Classroom, show us how to work Pear Deck. We want to be there and to support our children as they're participating in online learning. And this is going to extend beyond the pandemic and into in-person schooling. I think we're going to see a closer connection between the home and the school. Not that the home needs to repeat what's happening in the school. I think they're very different spaces, but need to be connected and supportive of the student in their progression in all ways, academic and social and emotional. So I think more of a positive connection with families is going to be hopefully one of the positive things that comes out of this.
Mr. Blair, what do you think? Do you have the same optimism?
No. Unfortunately, I have the same North Star and I have the same intent. I think that with leadership that continues to put the pressure on systems, we will get as close to where we need to go as possible. I have already, though, seen a general fatigue in the urgency and the tension that people are placing on these very important issues from the beginning of the pandemic to now. And so I think that the best that we're going to do is to recognize that that is happening and place it as necessary for all of us to not let up. And you know, budget season is right now for every school system across this country. So if you're invested in the public school system that you're about to go into or that you graduated from, they're having open hearings. Find out where those are and call into question and then call out some of the areas where we're not doing enough, because I do believe that it is possible for us to get to the appropriate resource allocation for our students. I do also believe that it is necessary for us to do more to put pressure on systems and to put pressure on leaders of systems in order for that reality to be actualized.
Got another question from the audience for Mr. Blair. What kind of enrollment losses have been experienced in Gwinnett County? And what are the future implications of those losses and potential solutions for them?
So they were interestingly diverse across the school district and across the grade level. And the greatest decrease in enrollment was in our kindergarten enrollment, which at first did not make sense to me. But then upon kind of doing more empathy interviews, I was understanding of, well, for folks who had their preschoolers and they were going to stay at home anyway, many of them did not enroll into the school at all. And so we're going to have to really pay attention to, and we don't have a strong pre-K to elementary continuum because they're not housed under the same funding department and funding streams and systems. So we're going to have to do a much better job at finding those students and making sure that we just are aware of what happened in the past year for them. And that's going to be, I think, the biggest need is our early grades. Overall, 10% decrease.
Can you say that one more time, the last part?
Overall, we saw a 10% decrease.
Wow. Wow, 10%. Professor Babinski, have you heard of or similar drops of enrollment in North Carolina? And I'm also wondering, have you heard of teacher effects, like maybe teachers who are sort of rotating out of the system?
Yeah, good question. So there are some state data available by county, and they are showing similarly that there's a drop in enrollment across the board in all grade levels. Comparing the fall's average daily attendance to the fall before, certainly more so in kindergarten. It's an interesting phenomenon. We're going to see this big kindergarten class in the fall when we're all back in person. As parents, I think legitimately chose to keep especially if their student was in a daycare or a preschool that remained open, allowing parents to have that resource. So that's going to be interesting. I haven't seen any data yet on a teacher exit from the profession. Is that kind of what you're asking about, whether or not we're going to see issues with teachers leave? I did a number of teacher interviews at the end of last school year, and I certainly heard the level of frustration and in some cases really despair in teachers when they talked about things like, this is not why I went into education, looking at a screen. Like, teachers get their energy from their positive interactions with their students, and you don't get that kind of feedback loop on a screen. And so I think there were a lot of teachers who were disheartened about this. I've seen a little bit of a bounce back with the teachers we're working with this year, kind of a resilience, and we're going to get through this and we're going to be there for our students. I think I think we're bound to lose folks though. And so in shifting to the positive, how can we recruit talent into education? What Mr. Blair was saying earlier about what a sophisticated skill it is to be able to scaffold instruction for students at many different levels of proficiency. It is a highly sophisticated skill. And I'm hoping that many parents who sat next to their kids at home with online learning have realized it is really, really hard to do well. And so as a parent, you're working one-on-one with your kid, but imagine, you've got 25, 27, and you're trying to scaffold all different kinds of needs and all different kinds of learning in one classroom. We need really, really talented, ambitious young folks who want to get into education and who see all the good they can do, especially in the next 5 to 10 years as we help this generation of students through education. So I think also in terms of a policy shift, figuring out how do we recruit students of color, highly talented students into the education profession and give them the supports they need to be successful.
Yeah, and I would say the more documentation and evidence that we can capture right now so that we don't forget in like 2 months, the better. Just thinking about how, kind of going back to this point of like some selective amnesia that I've seen over time, it's really important that we remember this moment and can show next year and in years coming that like we needed this then, and we still need to put those resources there. So anything that we can do to kind of gather and capture this time, I think will be helpful to us for a long time.
Got another fantastic question from the audience. Considering that many K-12 students, especially ones facing the largest socioeconomic disadvantages, have a litany of responsibilities, so it's difficult for them to be proactive, how do you think school boards should design strategies for actively involving the opinions and voices of students?
Ask them, put a process in place where you're asking students regularly for feedback. I mean, I know that sounds maybe terse and simpler than it is to enact, but I just kind of am noticing that we still don't really do it. And if I believe the premise behind the question, which is that their voices matter, and we should regularly engage them, because directly from the mouths of babes, you'll hear what the need is. And so oftentimes you get these adults in a room and we're like scratching our heads trying to figure out like, well, what are we going to do? And it's like, why don't we just ask them and then do what they say, which,
Yeah, I agree so much with that. And it's a really actually very good question, because if you think about it, our current high schoolers are going through an experience that none of us have experienced. They're having an experience right now, and they understand education in a way that those of us as adults can't comprehend. They're having an experience where we need to turn to them and we need to have their voice in figuring out the best path forward. And so I actually think it's really essential. It's not on them, of course. Our systems and our structures and our leaders need to be there to create opportunities for success. But our students have an insight into the issues right now that we don't have. And so we absolutely need to involve them and their voices in the decisions going forward.
And can I maybe add a pivot to this question, or just a slight amendment to it? What I love about the perspectives that you both bring to this conversation is your recognition of the various constituencies that are important to the educational endeavor. So you can speak to the student perspective, to teachers, to parents, to staff. Like there's so many people who are involved in education at the K-12 level. Wondering about how to involve those other voices. So thinking about the staff members who make our schools go, the teachers, the parents, how do we make sure that all of those constituencies have representation in the process?
That's another, I think, really important question that I've not seen operationalized perfectly. Because at the end of the day, there's still kind of some structure that ends up appointing a spokesperson for a really diverse whole. And so I do wonder what our best shot is at doing that. I do think that right now, I've seen really effective and empowering teacher advisory councils and student councils where you regularly bring together voices that you were not previously hearing because you're just getting a sizable enough collection of folks from a particular constituency. It's still not probably as comprehensive as doing a survey where you get input from every single person, but it does at least coordinate more perspective at a really important moment like this. The best that I've seen us be able to efficiently pull off in a direct enough way where we're able to actually use the feedback before I see systems make the decision anyway is in that kind of advisory council regular meeting function.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. So we're the Politics Center here at Duke and here at Sanford. And so I'm just wondering, to your mind, how might politics need to change in order to achieve the kinds of reforms that we've been talking about, or in order to address the kinds of challenges we've been talking about this hour? Just would love to hear your sense of, maybe the system is just so broken, we need to focus on other avenues to fix it. But do you have any hope for politics, and what might that look like?
Everybody always asks the meaty question at the end, but absolutely. And to try to answer succinctly, I think that the pandemic showed us the interconnectedness of social issues. And it also showed us the inextricability of us from our neighbors. And if anything, right, that should be a signal for us that we need each other, and that the institution that is here to actually make things work for all of us is government. And so good government solves problems. And if we invest in the right leaders and invest our resources in the right way for good government to do its job, it will serve all of us well. And I think having a targeted universalist approach where you center the greatest need first is what I've appreciated from our entire time together in this conversation. I think that the kind of political theory of change from this moment is going to be how much we remember, how much we needed everyone else, and how much really government is necessary, because if left to our own vices and devices, individuals will choose a variety of things to do in a pandemic. And as that comes into the school and the social arena of public education, we must recognize the importance of having leaders who do the right thing for all of us.
Thank you so much. Professor Babinski, is there any hope for politics?
Well, I agree with the point about the interconnectedness of all of us. And I'm hopeful that we can all get behind supporting children and families in coming out of this pandemic in a more positive and hopeful place. And I'm hopeful that we can get together with that mission. The point Mr. Blair just made about the awareness that we're all interconnected and we rely on one another, I'm kind of wondering what our current middle schoolers and high schools are experiencing about that through the pandemic. And if this next generation of leaders is going to understand that in a really fundamental way because of their experiences now. And so I'm hopeful for the future. And I think that many of us can make a good case for the need to support the success of children and the school as the hub of our community. And I hope that that can bring us together.
Thank you so much. On behalf of Polis, the Center for Politics here at the Sanford School of Public Policy, I would like to give a big thanks to our special guest for this evening, Professor Lesley Babinski, Director of the Center for Child and Family Policy and Associate Research Professor here at Duke University, and Mr. Everton Blair, Chairman of the Board of Education and Board Member representing District 4, Gwinnett County, Georgia. I'd also like to thank our Polis PhD Fellow, Morena Martinez, for amazing organizing, for Polis's Program Coordinator, Anna Kinnear, also for amazing organizing, and our amazing team of Polis Directors Fellows who are in the house tonight, Caroline, Catherine, James, Olivia, and Max. And to our audience, thanks so much for joining us here tonight and always. We hope to see you at our next Polis Innovation Accelerator event, which will take place on Tuesday, March 9th, same time, 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern. And we're actually going to be having a conversation about COVID-19 and higher education, and it will be moderated by the Sanford School's own Dean 𝗖𝗲𝗁𝗂𝘁, and we will have Durham Tech College's president, J.B. Buxton, in the house. So you won't want to miss it. You won't want to miss it. Please check out polis.duke.edu for more information. Thanks so much for being with us, and we hope you have a great rest of your night.